Welcome to this seminar today, and my name is Wenhua Zhao, and I'm very glad to introduce our guide, our title guest, Kevin Ewans, who is the director of the Met-Ocean Research Company, based in New Zealand, and also honorary professor at the University of Melbourne for engineering discipline. Ocean engineering discipline. And Kevin got the PhD in physics from the University of Auckland and has more than 40 years experience in offshore industry and with very strong background in Met-Ocean engineering. And Kevin has been working for different projects, for example, developing the Met-Ocean criteria for the design and operation of offshore structures across the world, and also applied the high-order spectrum analysis to identify nonlinear wave and wave interactions. Also involved in the looking at the potential effect of climate change on the intensity and the occurrence of extreme wave events. And also, quite a bit different project. Also looked at the assessing the performance of the ocean wave measuring instruments with applications for the offshore industry. And Kevin gonna talk through the wind and wave design criteria considering the potential climate change. So I will hand it over to you, Kevin, please.
Thank you. And did I actually give you all that information, or did you get that somewhere else? I don't think I'd have given you that much.
Trying to collect all the information the whole week.
Seemed like a bit over the top. I was beginning to wonder whether I was going to get enough time to make a start. Right, so okay, well, the title of the presentation is pretty clear. So what I'm presenting here is basically work that Bill, Jonathan and myself have been working on over the last couple of years. When time allows, we typically meet up once a week in the evening, my time, and we have a chat through how we're getting on, but that's the background to it. So it's kind of in two parts. The first part is the bulk of it, which is looking at the HS 100, so significant wave height of the return period of 100 years, and the effects of climate change on that parameter for two locations east of Madagascar and south of Australia. And the reason why those two regions have been singled out will become apparent shortly. And if we've got time, I'll take you through a case study for a coastal location off the west coast of New Zealand, where we looked at the effect of climate change on the 100-year return period of wind speed and significant wave height. So some acknowledgements. So one thing about the climate change deal is that you have to download a lot of data from international repositories, and the data are not easy to get off those sites. So we've had a bit of help doing those. So I recognise Alberto Mucci from University of Melbourne, who's helped. Zhenya Song from First Institute of Oceanography in China, who's helped with some of the CMIP 6 data, and Tom Durant from Oceanum in New Zealand, who's also helped with some of that work. So the motivation for this work is pretty obvious. Climate change is a big topic. Plenty of media coverage of extreme weather events, and typically the same little news item, you'll hear climate change mentioned. So there's an apparent increase in the intensity and the occurrence of severe storms, apparently, and that almost invariably in the news is attributed to climate change, rightly or wrongly. There's also been a number of wave studies, global wave studies, to assess the effect of potential changes on the wave climate associated with climate change. And of course, if there is, that has large implications for the coastal and offshore industry, particularly with the security of existing infrastructure. So one of the things they're keen to know is, are there design 100-year return periods, for example, for waves and winds going to change in the future, and how reliable are their assets for future climate. So that poses a number of questions. So indeed, can we actually estimate design criteria for the future based on climate change data? Can we determine a change in the return period from now to some time in the future? Because that's also important for existing infrastructure. If you have a fixed platform which has been designed to a certain criteria based on existing conditions, and we predict something else in the future, is that significantly different from what we've got today? And of course, the overriding question there is how well we can address those particular questions. So start with a bit of background. What's key to all of this is understanding how to deal with extreme values which may change in time. So we refer to it as non-stationary extreme value analysis. This is where Jonathan has had a big input. So we typically model our, this is going to work. So the H subscript superscript SP refers to storm peak sea states. So those are like peaks over threshold. We typically model those with a Pareto distribution. And when we're looking at non-stationary effects, we consider that over some given time. That's not going to really work, is it? So we're considering over some time between, say, naught and P, where naught might be time now and P might be at the end of the century. So we're pretty reasonably familiar with the generalized Pareto distribution. This is the equation for it. So it has three parameters, xi, sigma, and psi. They are the shape, scale, and threshold. And those parameters are allowed to vary in time. So that's where the non-stationarity aspect comes in. And the way we've dealt with it in this particular work is that we've allowed those parameters to vary linearly with time by that expression there. So we do the GP modelling for fourth thresholds. So, if you're familiar with GP modelling, or peaks over threshold modelling, there's always an issue over which threshold you should choose. So we've chosen four thresholds. So we have our peaks over threshold, and then we look at some non-exceedance probability for those peaks. We've chosen four. So we start with the lowest one of non-exceedance probability of 0.5, and then a maximum such that we have 30 peak sea states left. And then we logarithmically step the NEP between 0.5 and the NEP corresponding to 30 thresholds between those two. We have four in total. And the threshold itself is allowed to vary in time, and that is estimated with a quantile regression. And we also have the exceedance counts, annual rate of occurrence of the exceedances, modelled with a Poisson distribution, and that itself has a parameter which is the annual rate of occurrence, the rho t, and it's based on this expression here, where you have the annual number of exceedances as the parameter or the data that you're trying to model. And again, this rho parameter, so the annual rate of occurrences, it varies linearly with time. So once you have those GP and the Poisson distributions, you can then estimate the 100-year return period values, for example, and it's given by an expression in terms of the parameters that you've estimated. And so obviously, because these parameters are a function of time, so also is the 100-year return period value, for example. And all of those parameters in this work that we're doing have been estimated using Bayesian inference. Together with an MCMC algorithm, which allows to give you a number of data sampled from a posterior distribution. Now, if you're not familiar with Bayesian analysis, that won't mean a lot, but it's a popular way of doing these types of analyses these days. So essentially, what you get is, for example, you will get maybe 1,000 estimates of the 100-year return period value as a function of time. That also allows you to estimate, for example, the 100-year return period value at some time in the future, say 86 years in the future, compared with the 100-year return period value at time now. So, what I didn't mention was the reason why we've chosen eastern Madagascar and south of Australia. And it was because of the work by Mucci. Did I skip a slide there? Yes, no, I didn't. I remember now.
You saw his name.
So, yeah, I forgot to mention that a key piece of work was done by Alberto Mucci and a number of other authors. And they did a global wave climate study, looked at the 100-year return period height and found significant differences at the regions south of Australia and east of Madagascar, and amongst a number of other locations as well. The south of Australia, they saw a 10% increase in the 100-year return period value at the end of the century, compared with the current 100-year return period value. And east of Madagascar, the reverse was true, it was a 10% decrease. So our interest here was looking at whether we would still see those sorts of differences in a very, very focused analysis of the type of analysis you would do if you were trying to establish design criteria. Given that it's a global wave study, in the case of Mucci et al., they tend to be less, precise perhaps in the way they do their analysis because they're looking at so much data. Sorry, I missed that because that's, of course. Right, so the data sources. So we're probably familiar with the terms CMIP5 and CMIP6, which are kind of experiments which are kind of defined universally that people use to run their global climate models. So we have data from CMIP5 and CMIP6, and these have produced wind fields which are used to drive WaveWatch 3 program. And for the CMIP5, we have HS given at 6 hourly intervals. We have data from 7 global climate models as defined there, and these are the same models that are used by Mucci et al. In fact, it was Alberto Mucci who provided the data for us in that case. That consisted of a historical 27-year period, which went from 1979 to 2005. We had another period of data from the middle of the 21st century, going from 2026 to 2045, and then for the end of the 21st century from 2081 to 2100. And we had all of this data for 2 types of emission scenario, one with a RCP of 4.5, which was kind of like considered as sort of an intermediate emission, and one for RCP 8.5, which is considered a high emission scenario. And don't ask me what we're on course for at the moment. There's lots of discussion about that. In the case of CMIP6 data set, we had WaveWatch 3 model output data again. These were specified at 3 hourly intervals, and all of these data came from the FIO, the First Institute of Oceanography in China, so their model. And we had a number of different experiments from that data set. So we had one of the most interesting data sets there is the 700-year pre-industrial period data set. So we have data running from 301 through to year 1000. So purportedly without the influence of human emissions. Then we have a 165-year historical period running from 1850 to 2014, and then 3 emission scenarios for the future, each 86 years in length, for different nomenclature for SSB 126, 245, and 585, and these 2 here, 245 and 585, sort of more or less correspond to the 2 CMIP5 emission scenarios of RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. So here's our 2 locations. So eastern Madagascar is in the left-hand map. South of Australia you might recognise is in the right-hand map. And we chose locations along 2 transect, a meridian and a zonal transect, both locations, and the difference between the dots and the circles is a slight difference in the gridding pattern of the CMIP5 and CMIP6 data sets. All of the locations are essentially for water depths of greater than 1,000 metres, but there were 1 or 2 with somewhat less water depths in their locations east of Madagascar. But I think they're still sufficiently deep that they don't have any influence on the data. This is an example of some of the data. Here we're looking at peaks over threshold HS data. So let me explain. On the left-hand side, we have the CMIP5 data sets. Right-hand side, we have the CMIP6, the FIO model data. In the top row, we have the annual maxima of HS plotted. Down the bottom, these are just all the peaks above threshold. So, the first obvious point to note is how much more data you get if you consider peaks over threshold compared with looking at annual maxima. We considered annual maxima as well, but most of the good stuff came out of the peaks over threshold. The main difference between the CMIP5 data set and the CMIP6 data set is the fact that for CMIP6 we had a continuous run of data. For the CMIP5 we had obviously just three periods, so some gaps there. They don't really affect the way you do the analysis because we're just essentially doing a linear fit of the parameters right through the whole time period. So we just have some gaps for the CMIP5 data set, but so fewer data to make the estimates, so perhaps a little less reliable. So the first thing we do is some exploratory data analysis. So if we just look at the, if we take all of the peaks over threshold significant wave heights and we rank them in order from the largest to the smallest, and then we take the top 40 of each data set and we can then do some comparisons between the top 40 ranked storms. So this is what we've got here. So let's see. So on top left plot, we're plotting the CMIP5 data, so the middle period against the historical period to see what differences there might be. In the bottom, we're plotting the middle against the historical for tops RCP 4.5 for these two plots, bottom two plots for RCP 8.5. And then so, yes, so the left-hand side is the middle against historical, the right-hand side is the end against historical. And the first thing you see, so each of the lines obviously is a different global climate model. The grey one is the CMIP6 model. And the first thing you notice is that between global climate models, the peaks are really quite different. And the differences between the individual model peaks is at least as big as the difference you can see between the different RCPs, and at least as big as the difference between actually comparing the middle against the historical versus the end against historical. And those are the comparisons for a location at the centre point of the eastern Madagascar transects. Was there something else in there to say there? I thought there was. Yes. So the main thing you notice about the data eastern Madagascar is in general the peaks for the middle period against historical and the end against historical are both below the dash line, which suggests that the historical largest peaks are generally bigger than those predicted for the middle period and for the end period. So qualitatively for south of Australia, the behaviour and the variability of the various plots are much the same as eastern Madagascar, but the difference now is that the peaks are generally slightly above the dash line compared to slightly below the dash line, so there's a tendency for those largest peaks to be larger for the future than they are for the historical period. That's just an observation. We can do a similar sort of analysis for the rates of exceedance. That's essentially the number of storms per year. These box whisker plots, you're probably familiar with those. There's a lot of information in these. I'm sure that all of it's so important. But if you're familiar with box plots, then it's not worth going through those. But I think that the most important thing here for this is an east of Madagascar location, centre location, is that you can see that, oops, most of the time, I'll go on to the next plot already, most of the time the median value, which is this blue horizontal line here, and the red cross is the mean, is sort of generally a bit below 1, and the vertical scale on the left is the ratio of the number of occurrences for the future period against the historical. So if the number is less than 1, we're seeing fewer storms per year in the future compared with what it is historically. So again, the top row is for RCP 4.5 and the bottom row is for RCP 8.5, but the message is the same in both. So in most cases, the data is sort of distributed below the ratio of 1. In the case of south of Australia, it's again similar sort of range of data, but the kind of averages and the means, medians are essentially above ratio of 1, which suggests that you're getting an increased number of exceedances in the future by comparison of what we saw historically. So just looking at the data alone without doing any sort of extremal analysis, we can make some speculations. And for eastern Madagascar, we could say, well, we think just by looking at the top 40 storms and comparing the future with the historical, we can say that the storms we might expect to be less intense and less frequent in the future. And the opposite for south of Australia, could be more intense and they could be more frequent in the future. And this is kind of consistent with Mucci et al. Work. Now, as I mentioned earlier, fire control data set allows you to do some really interesting stuff because you've inherently got a steady state situation because we've not got any long-term trend effects associated with many humans on the planet warming up the atmosphere. You've only got the natural cycles associated with the interannual variability and the long-term atmospheric oscillations. So over a short period of time, they obviously introduce non-stationarity, but if you have many hundreds of years, you would hope that you've effectively got a stationary climate. So high control data set, which is the pre-industrial control data set, allows us to look at the effect of stationarity. So we can look at things like, well, let's say estimate the 100-year return period value as a function of time through that data set, not assuming a non-stationary extremal analysis, or we can do it assuming a stationary extremal analysis. So we can say, well, when we develop design criteria, we typically have historical data. So we have maybe 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years at most. And we do extremal analysis on that data set and we assume everything's stationary. We calculate our extremes. So the assumption is there that nothing's changing. And we can test to see how good that assumption is in terms of whether our data set is representative of the longer term or not by looking at these hundreds of years of climate control data. So we've got two things we can do. We can look at what we might expect with a non-stationary extreme value analysis, and then we know the climate is effectively stationary. So then we can get some estimate of what sort of variability we might get with a stationary climate doing this type of analysis, so we can match it against what we see we do it on the future data. And we can look at the stationary extreme value analysis and say, well, what sort of uncertainties might we have if we do applying a stationary extreme value analysis on historical data. I mean, we can look at how that varies with time. So starting with the stationary analysis, there's some complications. There's never no complications when you're doing these sorts of things. So if you look at this location east of Madagascar, we have a 700-year data set of fire control data. And one of the things we did do was do generalized extreme value analysis as well as a generalized Pareto distribution. So generalized extreme value analysis requires that you look at block maxima, say the largest events in the year, or longer block lengths, but typically people use a year. And we started out using a year and we found that we got unstable results. So what we've got here is plotted the annual maxima, the points, and then we've fit a generalized extreme value distribution through the points. So we've got 4 plots here, one for block length of 1 year, so annual maxima, and then we've got another for block length of 5 years, and then 10 years and 20 years. It's quite clear that if you just look at the block length of 1 year, so just looking at annual maxima, your fit to the data is going to really diverge from the largest values in the 700-year data set. But you need to go to a block length of 5 years in order to begin to get some stability and some matching of the fit with the tail. And that was, so 5 year block length is what you need to go to in order to to get some stability in estimating the tail of the distribution. And that corresponds roughly to the NEP3 that I mentioned earlier. So we have NEP 1, 2, 3, and 4. So NEP 3 and 4 are the two largest ones. So you have to go to a peaks over threshold NEP of 3 in order to get stability in the GP analysis, comparable to what you see here. And the reason for that is quite interesting, because it's apparent that eastern Madagascar, we had a mixture, even in the pie control, of a mixture of populations of storms. So we had both extratropical and apparently some tropical cyclones there as well, and that being recorded in the data set, which was a bit of a surprise. We've always been under the belief that those sorts of models wouldn't actually be good enough to resolve tropical cyclones, but we're certainly getting a signature in the data from tropical cyclones. And it wasn't until we saw this effect in the data that we started to look to see if this actually really is a phenomenon associated with eastern Madagascar. And sure enough, there is. They do get tropical cyclones there. They're not that frequent. That's why it doesn't really cause you a problem if you're going to 5-year block lengths. But if you start with a 1-year block length, you're missing some of those tropical cyclones. And that's the reason why the divergence in the tail. If you go do a similar sort of analysis for south of Australia, no problem with a 1-year annual maximum, as you might expect, because we've got just a single population of storms, so it's the Southern Ocean storms. No effects from tropical cyclones south of Australia, so all good. But it's an interesting contrast. And it's something that you'd miss, actually, if you were doing a global analysis, because you just don't have the luxury of zeroing in on such effects in such a big database if you're doing everything in bulk analysis like that. So now, if we look at the location east of Madagascar, the centre point, we have some estimates of the 100-year return period value for the pie control data set here. And each of these plots are for different segment lengths of data. So top left is 20 years, and the next one is 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. So picking out blocks, lengths of data, which we would typically have available if we're setting design criteria for facilities offshore these days. And what we did was we took a 20-year segment, started it at the beginning of the 700-year pie control, did the extremal analysis, and then moved the segment along 1 year and did it again and again and again. And there was a lot of analysis, a lot of computation time. And so what you get is estimates of the 100-year return period value, which is following that dark blue line with time. Black points to the peaks over threshold. The light blue band is the kind of 95% range in the estimates. But what you can see is, and the other thing is that the red line is the estimate when you use a segment length of 700 years. So you use the whole data in one go. So that kind of like is your target or best estimate of what the actual 100-year return period HS is. And it has a very narrow orange band associated with the 95% interval range, because there are so much data available to do that estimate. But the interesting thing is how variable. This is the median value. This blue value. Remember, I said you can get you have some like 1,000 data for each estimate, and from those 1,000 HS100s, you take the median. That's your best estimate of the 100-year return period value. The blue band gives you the 95% range in those 1,000 data. You can see the huge variability in the median, even with time stepping through that. So you can imagine if you were trying to set criteria for a platform and you chose a starting point of around about here, you would get a fairly large value. If you chose a bit later, so 100 years later, and you may get a quite a low value by comparison. That kind of gives you an estimate of the sort of ranges you can expect when you're setting design criteria, which is kind of a bit concerning with a 20-year database. And even with a 50-year database, you're seeing a range of plus or minus 5 meters in HS value. It's only when you start getting out to very long segment lengths, this is 165 years down here, that you're starting to get some really good stable results as you go through the segments in time. So what did we not discuss already? Done that, most of that. This is the results for south of Australia. So it's the centre point of the cross, if you like, south of Australia. It has similar results in terms of characteristics as the eastern Madagascar location. Not much more to say than that, really. This is for the highest NEP. Now, this is a plot showing how these estimates vary with latitude and longitude at the two locations. So it's not two locations. Yes, it is two locations. Yes. So the top two plots are for eastern Madagascar. The bottom two is for south of Australia. We're looking at the NEP threshold of 4, so that's the highest threshold. So what we've plotted here is the 95% confidence range of the estimates for the different segment lengths. So the dark blue is 20 years, and we go all the way through actually to 700 years, which is the red bands. And as you expect, short segment lengths, you get a large confidence range. This is interesting to see how these confidence bands change with latitude and longitude. There isn't much variation with longitude at both locations, but certainly at eastern Madagascar, as you change in latitude, you see a big increase in significant wave height and increase in confidence limits. That's entirely associated with the climatology of the tropical storms in the region. They become more intense and more frequent as you go further south. So this is a summary of the results you've seen for the centre locations at eastern Madagascar. So what you've got here is the dark band here is the 95% range of the 700-year estimate. The left-hand side is NEP3, NEP4 for eastern Madagascar. We only look at NEP3 and NEP4 for eastern Madagascar because of reasons I mentioned earlier. The left-hand axis gives you the 100-year return period values, range therefore. So this light orange band is associated with the 95% range of the individual estimates across the whole 700 years. So we have, you remember, we had this sort of moving window that went through. We had an estimate of the 100-year return period value at each 1 year step through there. If you look at all the median values associated with those segment moving window and look at the 95% range, then this is the range you get for 20-year segment length, and it decreases obviously as you go to 160 years. But it's interesting to see how often your estimate actually corresponds to the range that you would expect for the 700-year data set, or your truth, if you like. And that's given by these dark lines here. For example, this dark red one gives you the percentage occurrence on the right axis here, that the actual median value for a given segment length is within the 95% range of the 700-year estimate. So it's saying that 70% of the time is actually outside of that range. So you're not even within the 95% range of the 700-year value. About these statistics, there's a lot here. Probably better to go to the paper if you want some details, but there are the other lines here represent. So the second line here, the dashed line, gives the percentage of time that the 700-year best estimate, so it's a median value for 700 years, is outside the 95% range of the individual segment length, and it's generally quite small. And then there's a very low chance that actually you'll get no overlap between the 95% range of the individual segment estimates and the 700-year 95% range. But the most interesting one, I think, is this one here. You've got a very high chance of actually missing your 700-year best estimate high control. Discussed all that. And then we go to south of Australia. Qualitatively and even quantitatively rather similar results to eastern Madagascar. So again, it just really highlights the fact that if you've got a relatively short length of data, you've got a very high chance that your best estimate of the return period value will be outside the 95% range of the complete 700-year data set estimate. So some conclusions we can draw from the pi control stationary analysis. So we refer to the 95% credible interval, which is like 95% confidence range. That's the jargon used for Bayesian inference. You refer to the 95% range as the credible interval. So there's a 70% chance that you're outside the 95% credible interval of the full samples. That's a 700-year data set. And the difference is the range of the 100-year return period value for short lengths can be very large, around 5 metres. But it does reduce considerably with a long sample length of 165 years, but then you expect that. You don't typically have 165 years of data available for doing estimating current design criteria. So that's indicative of the uncertainties you can expect in design criteria under a station. All right, now we go to non-stationary extreme value analysis of the same data set. So we did sort of a similar thing. So we basically looked at the non-stationary extremal analysis of different segment lengths. We moved that segment window through the data set to see what sort of variability we might get in estimating the changes in the 100-year return period value between the start of the segment and the end of the segment. The sort of thing you might want to do with future climate data sets, just to get an understanding of how much variability is associated with that. Just one slide for this one. These are plots of the distributions of the. Now we're looking at the change in the 100-year return period values from the end to the start. So if we have these are probably density functions. So we have a value of 4 here, for example. We're saying that if there's a fairly low probability that we're going to see the end significant 100-year significant wave height being greater than the start significant wave height by 4 meters. And for the pi control data set, this is eastern Madagascar. You can see that actually they're both here. So the left-hand side is the eastern Madagascar, the right-hand side is south of Australia. You can see that they've both got similar variability in terms of the estimate of the change in significant wave height. And most of them are more or less centered around 0, which is what you'd hope, because we are looking at a stationary climate, so you expect 100-year return period value at the end to be much the same as the 100-year return period value at the start of your period of interest. But yeah, the last point is kind of interesting. If you take a random start point in your 700-year data set, and you say looking at an 86-year period, which is typically what we get for the future, and in a stationary climate, you would not be surprised to see a change of 3 meters with non-stationary analysis. So it's kind of a bit of a warning for how you might interpret the future stuff. So conclusions for pi control for non-stationary analysis. We get a direct quantification of the change in return value estimated from samples at a specific interval of data, and those results are entirely inherent in a steady state environment, steady state climate data set. And we can see differences of plus or minus 3 meters occurring quite frequently. Now we go to the climate future data set. So these are the predictions for the future based on the different emissions scenarios. And we run, obviously, a non-stationary analysis on those to see what differences we might get between the current time and the time in the future. So we calculate the joint posterior distribution. This is a bit of statistics speak of the model parameters for each combination of global climate model and climate scenario. So remember, we have quite a number of different global climate models, and we have scenarios for RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5, for example, and we can make estimates for each of those. And when we say we're doing a joint distribution of model parameters, which means we're estimating all the parameters of the GP distribution as well as the Poisson distribution, that are all jointly interrelated. Yeah, so those joint distributions of parameters allow us to make estimates of the 100-year return period value, and we can make the estimate for a point on time t equals 0 and a point at time t equals p, where t might be now and p is maybe at the end of the century. And we can look at all of the estimates we have and then make an assessment of the probability that we will see an increase in the 100-year return period value, say at the turn of the century, by comparison with what we see now. We can also make estimates of the expected size of the change in the return value. And then we can sort of throw everything into a big bucket and take a big average and see what that gives us. Because it's well known amongst the climate change people, that you really need to look at lots of models and lots of ensembles within models, ensemble funds, and then do some giant average. So we're kind of following standard practice in doing that. And this is kind of what we get. This is for Eastern Madagascar. So on the top row, we're looking at RCP 4.5. The bottom row, we're looking at RCP 8.5. And what we've got here is different coloured lines for the different GCMs. The vertical axis is the probability that the 100-year return period value at the end of the 86 years is greater than the 100-year return period value at time now. So obviously the scale goes from 0 to 1. And we've got different line types for the different NEPs. We're looking at NEP 3 and NEP 4 here. So there's a lot of predictions. And then the dark, thick black line is the mean of all the predictions. So if you're looking at a point at 18 south, then you see that the mean of all of these estimates over here is somewhere around about here. In terms of probability, and the dashed line is just the median. And obviously, you know, you get huge variability between the different GCM estimates and even between different NEPs. A bit more stability there, and also quite a bit of variability from one location to the next as we go across the transit. So what do you conclude from that? Well, if you picked just one of those and tried to get some sense out of it, you could be all over the place. But if you then average over the whole lot, and if you're comfortable with averaging over something like that, then you'll get a little bit of a bit more clarity, there's a bit more stability. So you see that for this location, the probability is generally less than 0.5 of seeing an increase. So we would conclude that we would generally get a decrease in the significant wave height with time in the future for this location. And as again, it's consistent with the work of Michi et al., who also did quite a bit of averaging in their analyses. But this is looking more closely, site-specifically in particular, and we're getting similar results if you do this broad-brushed averaging. Now, this is a result for south of Australia. Again, it's pretty much the same, all the estimates all over the place. There's a lot more lines because we have all NEPs included here. And again, the black lines correspond to the averages and the median. But you can see now that these black lines are actually got quite a high probability compared with the Eastern Madagascar results. So suggesting that there is a fairly high probability that your HS100 will be larger, say, at the end of the century than it is currently at the moment. And then overall, we can look at the overall mean of the 100-year return period value for all of those estimates. So we can look at the results for Eastern Madagascar on the top row, south of Australia on the bottom row, and we've got them as a function of latitude on the left and longitude on the right. We have different colours for the start and the end period. So the start is blue and the end is red. So we've got, so remember, we've got extremal analysis. This is a function of time. The estimates of 100-year return period values is a function of time. So we can look at what the value is at the start, and we can look at what the value is at the end. So that's what the blue and the red lines are. And the dashed and the continuous lines are the differences between RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. And if you look at the eastern Madagascar, we see that quite a change across latitude. So it's actually a similar result from south of Australia, but we generally see that the start values are higher than the end values, which is the red lines. For south of Australia, the reverse is true. So the red lines are generally higher than the blue lines. So the end HS100 values, so the values at the end of the century, are higher than they are at the beginning of the century. Yeah, okay, so that's probably all needs to be said about that. So we're looking at differences for eastern Madagascar of order of half a metre between the start and the end. For south of Australia, we're looking at, so that should be an increase for eastern Madagascar. For south of Australia, it's an increase of between 0.5 and 1 metre, depending on whether you're looking at RCP 4.5 or RCP 8.5. But the conclusion is really if you have just one or two data sets that you're looking at, then you can expect large variability in the estimates that you make from those data sets. And really, there is not a lot of evidence for change. You're really, in a way, almost clutching at straws if you're averaging across all that huge variability, in my opinion. So as the conclusions for the two locations, there's considerable variability in predictions of changes in storm severity at any number of locations. Definitely if you're looking at single estimates, they'll be very biased one way or the other. And we believe that doing a linear estimate of a possible change is justified in the sense that with such variability, the data really unlikely to provide support for doing a more sophisticated time dependence, such as just fitting a second order change with time, or maybe third order or something. And people do that. I don't believe that the data really would be sufficiently robust in order to support that. So a simple linear model is good enough to make the estimates. So we got here, so for eastern Madagascar, we needed to go to fairly large thresholds in order to not have our results corrupted by the mixture of populations, extratropical storm and tropical cyclones. We actually found that when we did that, we had good agreement between doing a block maximum type approach using GEV compared with a peaks over threshold analysis in GP, which was good. And again, our estimates of HS100 and the changes in the HS100 much less sensitive to threshold block length than it is to the choice of the actual global climate model of the data that you're working with, or even with an arbitrary choice of the location along one of those transects. Right, 10 minutes. Probably we think we should stop at this point and take questions, because this is probably going to take another 10 minutes. I sort of half expected we wouldn't get through this anyway.
Sure. That sounds good. When I had to go, I can take over the questions. But first of all, thank you very much, Kevin, for a great talk. Anyone would like to ask questions?
Yes. Are there any measured data sets at all that are long enough for you to test out your hypotheses?
Not really.
I mean, is the variability coming from the modelling?
Yeah. Well, what do you mean by that?
Reality.
We don't know. I mean, it's I don't know a lot about the way the modelling is done. I'm kind of like scratch on the surface. It's quite. You start doing some investigations and trying to understand what's actually going on. It's pretty difficult. It's a real can of worms. Honestly, I don't really know how they do it. So the errors could be, or the variability could be coming from the conditions they're using, the initial conditions, because they change the initial conditions and run a different, another ensemble, for example. And the results can be hugely different. In fact, I probably should just show you which is coming up this one. Yeah, so this is plot of the change in the 100-year wind speed. 100-year wind speed, right. One more. Yeah, this is probably a good one. So this is, that's not that one either. Maybe this one. Sorry. Yeah, I guess this one's all right. So all of these, this is predictions of the change in the 100-year wind speed at this New Zealand location for all these different models here. And these last bunch of models here were just different runs of the same model, same emission scenario, everything. The physics was supposed to be the same. Everything's the same except they changed, I think, the initial conditions. That's all they changed, just to tweak the initial conditions. And this is the sort of variability you get in the estimates of the 100-year return period value. So I honestly don't know. All I can say is there's a lot of variability coming from the output. When you run these models, huge amount. And this is not often, you don't actually often hear about this when you read sort of the literature about people making predictions about the future. They mention it quite often, but actually the significance of it, I think, is often kind of not highlighted so much.
Or swept under the carpet.
Well, I don't know about that, but it's kind of, I mean, I think there's a kind of a real intent to show a change overall. And, when you do averaging across all these different models and all the different outputs, you can actually see a change sometimes. Now, whether that's kind of realistic or not, if you look at the uncertainties associated with the estimation of that change, you often find in a case like this is that it's not different from zero. The range of 95% confidence intervals easily encompass zero change.
Two questions. First one, are we putting ourselves, when we do our extreme value analysis based on the last 20 years of podcast or 40 years of podcast, whatever our PS gives us, or where we get it from, in terms of is it the true value or is it going to change if we run it, our children run it? That's the first question. And second one, that variability between Madagascar and Australia, you can look at it, people say climate change, fewer cyclones, some people say more cyclones, but that could be the case. But how much does the natural variability into decadal natural variability play in that whole thing, as opposed to that, influence of the climate change? Speculate.
Yeah, well, again, so if you look at the pie control data set, presumably you've got all of the interannual variability. Well, you can plot out the seasonal effects, you see it, they do quite a good job of that, I think. And presumably they got all the, interdecadal effects, El Nino, La Nina effects, and so on in some way. I don't know how they would incorporate those, but I guess if they're trying to reproduce what's happening in the atmosphere, then they've got the physics of those sorts of effects in there somehow. So all of that's in the pie control data set, and there's, no post-industrial forcing of greenhouse gases, for example. It's constant. So the sort of variability you see in that data set is entirely associated with interannual and decadal-like oscillations. And that's presumably the reason why you see the variability in the HS100, for example, when you're calculating that, just associated with that, for example. But it certainly flies all over the place. It does make you wonder, where we sit with historical data sets. We do calculate all our extremes from at the moment. We could be just in one block of that pie control data set, presumably with also some forcing from anthropogenic forcing, but a lot of it, I think, is just associated with natural variability.
Any more questions for Kevin? Oh, yes, please. Sorry.
Sorry, just one last one. With those Plots when you're looking at probability of exceedance of the end versus the start, and presumably that's coming from assumed distribution. With extreme value distributions, they're quite wide. Is there a notion as well that some of that, it being hard to piece apart, is that there might be differences in parameter values that are driving them if we're going to assume a statistical model for those, but you're still getting a lot of overlap of the distributional mass? Did you look at the difference between those two things?
I'm not quite sure quite got the question right, but just say it again, please.
So I guess if we're talking in that non-stationary sense that we're looking at a difference at the the end of the time record versus start.
Yeah.
And if we're looking at something like a Pareto or a GEV distributions, they're very broad distributions. And so you can have quite separated parameter values, say a mean, but still have a lot of distributional overlap.
Yep.
That makes it in reality almost insignificant.
So what would be insignificant?
You might have almost definite separation of the mean, but in reality there's overlap of 98% of the distribution.
Yes.
Say.
Yep.
Have you looked at that in terms of looking at the parameter values versus the actual distributions, and can you see that at all? Or?
Well, we haven't zeroed. Yeah, actually we have a little bit, but it's kind of complicated because you've got a number of different parameters and they're all varying. So you can't really, it's difficult to pick up trends in individual parameters, especially if you've got, 4 or 5 parameters that you're estimating here and they're all a function of time. So it's much easier just to look at something that you derive from those parameters, like the 100-year return period value, because it gives you an overall effect. So but you're right. There's a lot of overlap, and that's kind of the nature of the game, really. If you're looking at start versus end, how much overlap is there? Is the overlap big or small? Do you have a significant change or not? That's kind of what it's all about.
Cool. Yeah.
We've got one more question here.
How is it, Kevin, that a bigger block size mitigates mixing tropical cyclone and non-cyclonic storm?
Yeah. So if you're looking at a year's worth of data, there may be a tropical cyclone in that. There might not be. So they're quite rare, actually, east of Madagascar. So you might get one only once every 2 or 3 years or something.
So you get a representative contribution of non-cyclonic storms in a larger block.
So in a larger block, you pick one maximum. So over 5 years, you pick one maximum. It's almost certainly going to be a tropical cyclone. Because they're bigger, tend to be bigger than the extratropical.
Even down there?
Well, yeah. And, the further south you go, it's even a stronger influence. Most definitely, yeah. It was a bit of a surprise, actually. I was quite chuffed, and I just did a search on the internet. I thought, what's the climate do they have there? And then I saw that they do have these, infrequent tropical cyclones. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And you see them in the data, which is really surprising, even in the pie control data set.
You wouldn't assert that they're accurately represented.
No, this is true. Yeah. But they definitely picked up, and there is a difference between the characteristics of the two types. And as you can't really even go back to a historical data set and compare storm tracks or something, because they don't do that. It's not actually historical. It's just historical conditions. Yeah.
It's just what the model throws in.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you need the 700 years of pre-industrial record to figure out what the actual 100-year HS is. So if we're looking for what happens after, over the next 100 years, could you hypothetically we do something for the next 100 years and then we reach a steady state for the next 700 years? I mean, is that a possibility if you're doing this hypothetical?
So there's a couple of experiments that we've shown here. So the 2 experiments for the CMIP6 data set, the Chinese data set, was they also did just like a bulk increase in CO2 of, there were 2 experiments, one where they linearly ramped up the CO2 with time, and the other one where they just smashed a big CO2 value in it.
Yeah.
And compared those 2 as well. But again, the variability in the results for those is just as wild as they are in the data here.
Any last minute questions? We can wrap up there, but thank you very much again, Kevin, for